Leaders, real life leaders.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. And we have Richard Parker of richardparker.com with us. And we are talking all about how to sell your business and how to make sure you buy a business that is profitable and that is an amazing asset. So Richard, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
So tell us, let's start with the sell side of things, and then we'll move to the buy side. So when someone is, let's say someone has a business right now and they're thinking about selling, because I know a lot of people who are like, I'm not quite ready yet, but probably in a year or two, I would be ready to sell. What would be some tips that you would give those people who are looking to possibly sell either now or down the road?
Okay, well, the first thing is I tell all of them that the time is going to come at some point that they are going to sell their business. I mean, every business turns over, the average is about every 5 years in America. And there's really a few things that are so important to this process, which if they do today, even if they're planning on selling a year, 2 years, or 3 years, there's a few things that they could do immediately that will not only help improve the value when the time comes to sell, but it's actually going to improve their business in the short term and make their business a better business. So it's something that they absolutely need to do. The first thing is maintain flawless books and records. It helps you run your business better. You have a better understanding of your cash flow. And when buyers look at businesses, that's the first thing they go to. So if your books and records look like a plate of spaghetti and they can't get to the bottom of things, the buyer pool shrinks dramatically. People are not interested in looking at companies that have awful books and records. The second thing is related to the processes that you have in place, to make sure that you have processes, procedures, and systems in place so that someone can take over the business and operate it, have a good understanding pretty quickly. Furthermore, it allows you in your existing business so that everybody knows what is going on and what to do in certain cases. And when you hire and train new people, makes that easier. The third thing is to think about this from a standpoint of what happens if you get hit by a Pepsi Cola truck tomorrow morning? What's going to happen to the business? Does it disappear? Do you have a second person in place? Do you have all these mechanisms to take care of the business? And so that lends itself or bleeds into the second point as well. But those 3 points, the overarching theme to those 3 is run your business like you have to sell it.
I love that so much because it is true. It's like, you never know, you could get cancer and boom, you've got 2 months to live and you've got to make sure that you're able to sell your business. So I love that. So let's pretend a business, and I know there's so much that goes to it, but let's pretend that somebody is making approximately, for the last, just for easy math, about $100,000 in profit per year. There's a lot of different ways that people say, okay, how do you get my business value? If I do want to exit, how would I figure that out of how much the business is worth?
Okay. So as you mentioned, a lot goes into the valuation, and if you had the rest of the afternoon, we could probably cover about half of it. But in short order, I think it's more important for people to understand what goes into the formula to establish the value, so they understand. So when you're talking about a smaller business, typically an owner-operated business, we don't deal with the fancy Wall Street terms like EBITDA and operating EBIT and all that, operating income. It's called owner benefit or seller's discretionary earnings or adjusted earnings. Sometimes it's adjusted EBITDA, but the philosophy behind it is the following. When you sell an owner-operated business, whoever buys it is going to become the owner-operator of that business. So you leave, they take your chair. And so what happens in those cases is, here's what the calculation entitles. You take the net income off the tax return, plus you add back the following items. You add back the owner's salary. You add back the interest. You add back the depreciation. You add back any one-time expenses. And then you come up with a number. And that number, and of course, if it's a heavy-duty manufacturing business, there has to be an offset for buying future equipment. But that number, which is called an adjusted earnings, that is then subject to a multiple. And the multiples vary from 1 to many times. The average small business at that level, and I don't want to paint myself in the corner, is going to go to 2 to 3 times that number. So the multiple is attached to the number, and that's what the valuation is established for the business. So this valuations are not based on what a seller thinks their business is worth. Valuations are not based on what a seller needs to retire. Valuations are not based upon what the seller invested in their business. It's based on math. It's based on concrete numbers of financial statements that are then attached to a multiple, and you arrive at a valuation for the enterprise.
So let's say with the example that I gave, so we said $100,000, and then let's say we use the multiplier of 3. So if you made $100,000 over the last, 5 years, and then you'd say, okay, I'm going to take 100,000 times 3, that's 300,000. And then I would subtract out, let's pretend that I guess you would say, let's say the CEO, you're saying the owner operator, if it was an
Yes.
owner operator run business,
That's the whole number.
Let's pretend that the owner operator was making a salary of $100,000 a year. You're saying you would subtract that out where before you multiplied it?
No, you don't subtract it out. You actually add it back in. So you take the number, because I'm buying your business and I'm going to operate your business. So what's going to happen is, on the day that I take over, you move to your office, I put my butt into your chair, I'm the new operator. So what you're trying to come up with is a number that I, as the new owner, am going to have available for me to take a salary, grow the business, service any debt. Same scenario. So just think of it, it's like one owner leaves, a new owner comes in. They're just swapping positions. So in order to arrive at that, I have to calculate how much you're putting into your pocket, or what's available in total cash that has been available to you based on the profit on the income on the tax return, plus your salary, plus your perks, plus your healthcare, plus anything you may have taken out of the business. Plus those one-time expenses. You had a lawsuit last year and it's not going to repeat. All that number combined, including your salary, is what goes, you come up with that number, and then a multiple is attached to it. Now, some people say, well, but I still have to operate the business. I have to take the salary off for putting someone into place to manage that. No, you don't do that, because these are based on owner-operated businesses. If a buyer chooses to put in a manager, that's their decision. Thereby, the seller is selling them a business somewhat like you would do in real estate, as is. Here's what I'm giving you. Here's what we know how the business does. Changes that you make going forward, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, that's your decision. I don't get penalized for that. I get a price based on what I'm delivering for you today. That's why it includes the owner's salary, because it's this swap out idea. One leaves, the new buyer takes their position.
So let's talk about this, because I think that obviously there's so many factors affecting small business valuation. And I feel like it used to be, when I would look at different people and ask people about valuations, they would kind of say they were more on the 3 to 5 times, what the annual revenue is. And now when I'm talking to more people, they would say, and maybe it's because of the difference of what you said, where businesses where the owner is actively involved, they typically sell more for 2 to 3 times the annual earnings of a company. So would you agree, or is that just me, that I in my mind, I feel like I used to feel like people would say, if you're, obviously there's so many things involved, but I feel like people were like 3 to 5 times a while ago. And now the trend is leading more towards 2 to 3 times.
Well, it's a good observation, because multiples have definitely come down, not necessarily as dramatic as that, but we also have to understand the scope of the business. In a small business where there is some, certainly risk involved and what have you, there's certain multiples that make sense in the use of their money versus buying a business versus other investments. And the way to look at it is as follows. You have in your spectrum of investments, and you're in the real estate business, but let's take 2 polar opposites. You could put your money in a certificate of deposit at one end, or you could put it on 17 Black in Las Vegas at the other end and get 35 to 1. So one, you get a couple of percent, 135 to 1. Also, you can put all your money in the stock market and get about 11% historically. A business has to fit somewhere between the stock market and putting it all in Las Vegas, not because it's risky like Las Vegas, but you have to work as well, and it's an illiquid investment. So I always say you should have a 25 to 33% return on your invested cash. So let's say that, because that's reasonable based on other opportunities that you have to invest your money. So let's say an exact example that you cite, someone pays all cash for the business, which I would never tell anybody to do because there's wonderful ways to leverage. But let's assume they pay all cash for the business and they can put $100,000 into their pocket and the business is going to sell for $300,000 and they pay $300,000 cash and they're going to get back $100,000, right? Well, there's fits your 33% model. Now, let's say on a business that size, they said, well, we want to hire a manager. Well, if the business is only making 100 grand, you're not going to hire a $100,000 manager. Your manager is probably going to be about 30 grand. I mean, for a business of that size, it's not a big, obviously not a big business. So even in that case, if you took out the 100 less 30, it's $70,000. It's still over 20%, I guess 22.5% return on your investment. It makes sense. You're not going to do this to return 15% because you're better off to put it in the stock market or real estate, or because again, you're operating the business. So the multiples have to make sense relative to the return that you get on your invested capital. Similar to cap rates in real estate, except they're a little different in buying a business, but conceptually that's the way it is because you have other options for your money.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about starting a business, they always their first reaction is to think about starting a business from the ground up. But not all businesses start from the ground up. Buying an existing business is a great way to leverage an established brand, to have operational infrastructure, to profit immediately. And it can also be a lot less risky than starting from scratch. So I want you to kind of give us some top tips of like, what kind of due diligence do they need? How can they evaluate the financials? What are some of these things, kind of like what you just said, instead of paying cash right up front, maybe an option is, putting some money down, keeping the original owner, having some equity in it. Give us your top 5 tips right now if they're looking to buy a business.
Well, I got to tell you, you covered a lot of them right there. So that's great. You obviously did your homework and you know what you're talking about. So certainly I'll start with the first one and go backwards, which is the leverage. You absolutely want to get the seller to finance the transaction. 91% of our clients do that. I've bought 14 companies from $50,000 to over $200 million personally. And I always get the seller to have skin in the game. So sometimes it could be, a substantial portion. Other times it's combined with
let's stay right there.
Yeah.
I want you to kind of go deep on that. So let's discuss, because if they want, they can have skin in the game, because there's a difference between having skin in the game and also having, working it day to day. Because I want to talk about that, because let's say an owner their health isn't good, right? And they go, look, my health isn't good. I don't mind having some ownership in it. I'll finance it, but I want nothing to do with, day-to-day operations. When you're talking about skin in the game, talk a little bit about them being any kind of involved in the owner, the daily operations, versus they just have financial skin in the game.
So there's 2 scenarios. If on the second one, when they have financial skin in the game, is you purchase a business, we'll use the same prior example of $300,000, and an individual puts down 100 grand, and I'm just using this for example only. The seller carries the note of the balance of sale. So the buyer pays off the seller over X number of years at Y percentage. The seller effectively becomes the bank. And in that case, when we say skin in the game, it's a wonderful thing, because what's very important, small businesses are small business for a reason. They haven't grown into big business. And there's generally more risk with a real small business, because oftentimes they don't have the policies, procedures, systems, or sometimes even growth potential. So keeping the seller involved and when I say involved from a financial standpoint, that they're financing the whole balance of sale. That's the only true way for you to validate as a buyer what the seller has represented about their business. Of course, you're going to do due diligence, but this keeping the seller involved financially. The other thing is understanding that banks don't finance small businesses unless it's SBA loans, and there's a whole lot of collateral security that's involved. So oftentimes the only way an individual can sell their business at the lower level is by financing part of the transaction. Because if not, there's no avenue for a buyer to finance it. So seller financing is the norm in these transactions. Now, to the other point about keeping them involved, that's an individual decision whether or not they want to stay involved, whether or not they want to retain some ownership. It's got to be a very good situation for the buyer, because keep this in mind. If I come in and buy your business tomorrow, right, while you may want to stay involved or health-wise, your employees, it's going to be very difficult for your employees and your clients and your suppliers to suddenly getting used to me when you're there as well, or they know they can pick up the phone and call you. So even the cultural transition could be difficult by keeping the owner involved. There are cases where you may need to keep them involved because they have relationships with certain clients or suppliers or what have you. But when you buy a smaller business, you want it to be your business. You want to have the seller there to transition, to train you, and then get the guts of the business into your belly, and then get them out. I mean, you've got to leave your own mark on the business and run it properly. And if you're keeping the seller there as a buyer because you think the business is too difficult to run, well, you shouldn't buy the business.
Yeah, so let's do some practical. I would like to make things as practical as possible. So back to my original analogy, let's say a business was making $100,000 a year, and we decided we were going to do a 3 times multiplier on that at 300,000. And then let's say the CEO had $100,000 salary. So then you would add $100,000 back, right?
No.
So that
Take the $100,000 as the all-in number, including the owner's compensation, plus all of their perks and benefits. All in, all of that included was $100,000.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And then becomes $300,000 as a selling price.
And then let's pretend it was that last year they did $50,000 in one-time expenses. So now we're going to add that back in, and we're going to let's just say $350,000.
Yep.
Right.
Or it'd still be the multiplier. If that whole thing is 100,000 plus there was a one-time expense last year of 50, that gets added to the 100.
Oh, I see.
Okay. And then it's become 450.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Got it.
So now let's just pretend. Okay. So 450, that's a good.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're at 450. Now, out of that, what are you typically seeing that the person should put down? If you're representing the buyer, you would say, all right, let's put down this much. And how long is it going to be for them to pay it off?
Great question. So the initial answer is put down as little as possible. You're not going to buy the business for zero down, but you put it down as little as possible, as much as you can leverage, of course. The average is 30 to 50% down that for in the smaller businesses. Now, should you be able to buy that for about 150 down and a $300,000 note? Entirely possible. Entirely possible, especially because
but I want to also look at it on the seller side of things, because if the person only put down 30%, my reaction would be, in looking at my business, I would be thinking in my head, okay, well, this guy who's looking to buy my business, he could run the bit right now. It's making all this money. Now this guy could come in and take it over, and then he could kind of, make it worth less. So to me, if I was selling the business, I would think I would not sell it for any less than 50%. If I'm looking at it,
it's a very good way of looking at it. And that's why I said the number is typically 30 to 50%. It's a very good way of looking at it. The other way you have to look at that as a seller is understanding that if you truly want to sell your business, you are going to more than likely have to provide some of the financing. All cash deals are very, very rare. And if you want an all cash deal, first of all, the buyer pool shrinks dramatically. The second thing is you're going to have to take a significant haircut on the price because of the terms, because someone else could just go down the road and buy something else similar. So yes, I do agree with you that you want to have, 50% is a good marker from a seller standpoint. But overlaying all of this, it all sounds wonderful from a buyer's perspective, from you as the seller's perspective, but you also need to understand as a seller that by and large, the only way you're getting this deal to the finish line is providing financing. And so it's inescapable. It's not what my opinion, it's not what you want. This is the world of buying and selling small businesses, because banks outside of the SBA program, which a lot of businesses don't qualify, a lot of individuals don't. It's a phenomenal program, but not all businesses and individuals qualify for. If you want to sell your business, this is the way it gets done. in the smaller market, because banks, despite their ads on TV that show, look, you make you think that the vaults are open and they're going to be, you walk in and they're going to give you a wheelbarrow full of money. They don't lend because the buyers don't have a track record. They just don't do commercial lending on a business, because unlike real estate, it's a highly illiquid asset.
Mhm. Yeah. What about a company that has let's say like a lot of technology where they're actually selling the tech platform? So like, I'll give you my company. We've spent probably $2 million on building our own tech platform that takes basically probably about 5 people's jobs. So meaning like, because of the technology we have, at least 5 humans we can employ 5
Right,
less
right,
humans
right.
because of it, you know? So just because of everything that happened with COVID and just hiring has been a nightmare, it's like, let's just make this as tech friendly as possible. So what about something like that, where in my case, I've spent $2 million on technology. How would you add that factor into place?
It's a great asset potentially, and it could add significant value as long as the investment that you made either is or will be driving profits of the business. Like if you spend $2 million in technology and it doesn't result in a whole lot more in profits of the business, then it wasn't a good investment in technology. If, however, it's saying, well, it's going to take 3 years or whatever to really get going, but then there's going to be this quantum leap, which is often the case when you invest in those type of platforms, then you can have an earnout where someone. So if it doesn't generating the profits today, you can have a transaction with a prospective buyer that says, I want X for my business, but I know it's going to generate a whole lot more in 3 years from now. So I want an earnout based on what it's going to generate in the next 3 to 5 years as either a percentage of revenue or a percentage of profits. But make no mistake, what you invested in your intellectual property could potentially be worth a lot of money, even on its own without the business, because that technology may be very valuable to someone in your industry who wants to implement that technology and says, I don't want your business. I don't need your business, but I need that technology. So that in some cases is actually worth more than your business.
Right. And have you done any sales like that where you just bought and sold, help people with the buying and selling of the technology side?
It happens all the time. I've been involved in a number of them over the last couple of years. The SaaS business has gone bonkers. Like they're paying a multiple of revenues. Subscription-based services. So I haven't done any in a couple of years, and they've gone again. Subscription-based businesses, multiples have gone really high. There's a big value to that. And so when you develop software for your business, the 2 ways, like you did your own internal systems, 2 ways that you have to look at it, Chantal, is one is, how's this going to help my business immediately? Can I see a payback from that? Because you don't want to just throw money. If you're just throwing money in technology and it's not leading to bottom line, you might as well light it on fire. But similarly, you want to look at it and say, is the application of this platform valuable to someone else as well within the industry? Because that alone could be quite valuable. And platform-based business and technology are all over the place. For the point that I exactly mentioned, which is, what is the actual value to the world at large for the technology? And then certain categories get very hot at some point at time, and so the popularity fuels the multiple.
Yeah. And I can also look at it as this way, like part of what our software does is it's an onboarding software. So it helps employees and agents onboard, but it also allows for all kinds of different checklists and things like that. I could probably even sell it to a totally different business, because almost every business onboards people, offboards people, has a place for them to see their manuals and their checklists and what they're supposed to do and all of that. So that's another idea.
Yeah, no, it's great.
What other tips can you give people of, if they're looking to buy a business, you've got to do boom, boom, boom? What are those for you?
boom, number one, you got to educate yourself. So you've got to get knowledgeable about the process because it's all new. It's not like buying property. It's very, very different. So most people have never bought a business before. So educate yourself and become familiar with the entire process so you know how to navigate your way. The second boom is making sure that you buy the right business. So get very in tune with your strengths and weaknesses and what skill set is your best skill set, because even if you find a good business, if you're the wrong person to operate it, it's not going to do well. And similarly, if there's lots of businesses out there operating from the wrong people or by the wrong people that represent really good opportunities, if you're the right person to buy it. The third thing is to understand is there's no such thing as a perfect business. So you want to understand that, if you keep looking for the perfect business, you're going to keep looking forever. And so you want to come understand that. And the fourth thing is, I'm a prime example of it and I deal with it every day. This is doable. This is buying businesses. They use the word M&A and mergers and acquisitions, which is fancy jargon for buying and selling businesses. But the reality is on the ground, Main Street, businesses are bought and sold every day. This is doable by and for individuals. And so they shouldn't get intimidated. This is something that's very realistic. So if someone really wants to, control their career and have the opportunity to have an opportunity, meaning they have an opportunity to have no limit on their upside potential, understand this is doable. Most people are very intimidated just because they don't know what's involved. However, this is something that's attainable. I didn't go to college. I didn't start off with a whole lot of money. And I bought 14 companies from $50,000 to over $200 million over a long career, of course. But it's something that I'd want people to, as a takeaway, to understand. If you have any inclination to do something like, if there's any entrepreneurial blood flowing through your veins, you should learn about it. At the very least, learn about it, what's involved.
Yeah, I think what you said about deciding the type of business that you want to buy and making sure that it matches yourself and your identity, because it goes without saying, like, you should align yourself with a business that matches your interest. Entrepreneurship isn't easy, and you're going to burn out if you don't authentically enjoy what that business is. And so I don't think people talk about that side of things. So I'm really glad that you said that, and kind of spending some time journaling and gaining clarity on what is it that you like? What's your experience? What's your interest? What's your passions? And make sure that you really are in alignment. I think that's something that people maybe underestimate how important that is. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And at the top of that list is a skill set. Don't try to be something you're not. Make sure that you buy a business that you're perfectly suited to own and operate. And a lot of that wonderful stuff related to interest and passion, that even comes afterwards, right? Because as you learn about the business and you're interested and you're building something and you're empowering employees and you're building value and your lifestyle is getting better, all of that exciting stuff very often comes after the fact. And so you start off by making sure the business is right for you. And similarly, don't get delusional, because just because, for example, you have a passion for food in no way qualifies you to run a restaurant or a commissary or a catering company. It's, right. So there's a lot that goes into it to make sure ultimately what I tell people, whatever it is that you do best has to be the driving factor, the revenue and profit you consider purchasing. That alignment, as you pointed out, and the skill set alignment, it's critical to the whole process.
So, okay, I've got another question for you. I was thinking about from my own business. So I pride myself on, we have probably 12 months or more worth of monthly expenses saved in our account.
Good for you.
Yeah. So, it's funny because Dave Ramsey, he says, you should have between 6 to 12 months worth of expenses in your personal account. And so I guess I just remembered that from a long time ago. But I guess that would be another question. So if somebody was going to buy the business and that was important to me, and I wanted them to have 12 months of expenses, obviously let's say someone wanted to put 50% down in my business, I wouldn't want that operating capital to be my money. I would want that to be their money. And I'd also want it to be, even though I'm a little obsessive where probably 12 months is a lot and I don't need someone to come in with 12 months, I would probably feel comfortable where I would want someone to do 6 months talk about how that would work, and is that reasonable, what I'm saying?
Well, first of all, congrats to you, because most business owners don't have that. And so that's a very prudent way to look at things. I think realistically, I think it's reasonable. It's reasonable, but it's not entirely realistic, meaning what people necessarily have available. The average, they should have around 3 to 4 months to anticipate a decline. And I think that's more reasonable and realistic. Where I think you bring up a terrific point is very often buyers go in and don't give that any consideration at all. And so what happens is, and when an owner-operated business is sold, oftentimes it declines for the first month or two, because everybody's getting used to a new owner. There's a new owner in place. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts and unfamiliarity for the owner, for the old owner, for the employees, the customers, the suppliers. So oftentimes the business declines. And I tell people, you have to account. My guiding principle is you need to account for a 25% decline for the first 3 months. And I think that if you look at it that way as well, that provides you with your working capital. So you have to make sure that you have at least that amount of money. And if you go into it, I think 4 months, 3 to 4 months is a good amount that they should have available. And certainly as and that's one big advantage related to buying with a seller note. Even though you're taking as we're role playing now, and you're playing the role of a seller, how much you would grant. If you're the role of the buyer, you know that if you run into any trouble whatsoever, you have the seller as your banker. It's not Wells Fargo or Bank of America, right? Where they don't care what the story is. They're coming in, they're locking the doors. Your seller's note, they could see it firsthand that you're trying, you're doing some right things. There's just a little bit of decline. They'll be patient. They may be able to give the note a holiday for a couple of months. So you have a lot more leverage. So I think there's a couple of parts to the working capital. Undoubtedly, people need to think about that and make sure they have it. That's one of the big things that I always get really aggravated about, all these, self-anointed gurus that are pitching people this idea of buying distressed businesses for no money down. The first thing is you're getting a shit business, excuse my French. It's a crappy little business. That's the first problem. And the second problem is you have to put money in. It's distressed for a reason. So when looking at this, I think the key point with all of this that you brought up is when you're making an acquisition, you have to think about the working capital piece.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, obviously if someone wants to review some different things before, you talked about due diligence, they need to be able to review some different things before they buy the business. Let's talk about, because they need to be kind of an investigator and kind of like a forensic analysis, to kind of say, okay, do we have hidden issues? What are some problems that we have? So let's talk about very specific, kind of like, okay, obviously they need to get the articles of incorporation. If they're incorporated, they need business licenses and permits, maybe an org chart. Give us some other things, like existing contracts or leases, like whatever, things that they owe. Give us some more things that you would want to kind of have as a checklist of things people need to review before buying the business.
Okay, so we have in our materials, and I've always used, we have a 200-point due diligence checklist because there are that many items, potentially, not all businesses, but amongst all businesses. So first thing, let's start at the top, which is the financials. So from a financial standpoint, you want to be able to look at the internal profit and loss statements, the balance sheet, and the company's tax returns. The one thing you do not want to pay attention to is when owners tell you that there's a certain amount of unreported income in the business, like the wink, wink cash sales. You pay no attention to that. That you cannot prove, you cannot validate it. So the overarching theme to the financials, if they can't prove it, you can't pay for it. So you have to look at the 3 years at least of financial statements, compare them side by side. You want to look for situations where sellers have reduced certain expenses to pretty up the numbers in anticipation of their sale. And you see that quite frequently. Then some of the other pieces that you want to investigate, of course, any contracts that are in place related to customer contracts. You have to make sure that they're transferable to you as the new business owner. Because if the company has contracts, whether it be, on services that they provide, products that they sell, relationships that they have, you have to make sure that those are either transferable or you're able to get them again. One key thing to be able to look at is, and you see it in small business, are there any licenses, specific licenses that are required to operate the business? And I'm not talking about licenses related to a occupational license. I'm talking about licenses related to certain trades and skills. A general contractor has a license. You have to make sure that that license, that either you have it or the license is transferable. So there we've covered a bunch of things related to hard items that have to be considered. Further, then you start investigating the sales force, the employees of the business. Has anything been promised? Are there any lawsuits related to the company? Past ones or future ones, as it goes back to the financials, and this ties into it. Have they reported all of their withholdings? Have they paid all their retail sales taxes? Next is environmental issues. If this is a company that has anything related to environmental, that has to be validated, bringing in a professional, because environmental issues follow you. So you as the buyer, if there's an environmental issue related to the business, you're as liable as the seller who sold it to you. Our environmental follows everybody, right? It doesn't just, no matter what your contract says, no matter what your purchase agreement is, if you acquire a business and there's environmental issues, even if you've said, well, you were going to be indemnified, no, you're in the boxing match as well with everybody else. And so that's something to really be considerate about. Then you get into certain areas like customers. Obviously, a retail business is different than a wholesale business, but if it's non-retail, you want to make sure that the customers are going to continue to buy from you. And so you need to
because the customers aren't guaranteed. Like, even if the business has an existing customer base and steady cash flow, there's no guarantee that the customers will remain loyal. Like,
correct.
Sometimes they're loyal to the owner or
exactly
not to the business itself. So, a change of ownership could give them a reason to switch over to a competitor who might have less experience.
Absolutely. And
or
so
more
experience, right? So in the example, obviously retail type businesses are less vulnerable to that. But if you're talking about Frank's Plumbing and people are used to calling up and Frank or one of Frank's guys comes over to do the plumbing, that becomes a little more dangerous. So you want to make sure if the owner of the business is the business, and if the assets of the business, meaning the owner leaves at 5 o'clock every day, and those are really your hard assets of the business, there's no guarantee, then you're going to need protections in place to make sure the customers continue. And so that's really important. Similarly, if you go to some of the retail side or businesses that rely on location, another thing to look for in due diligence, and I'm trying to pick out a bunch of different areas for you to provide some color and context on this, is leases. You want to make sure if they occupy a building, this is critical related to a retail business, to make sure that the landlord is going to transfer the lease to you. And the language.
And not only that, a lot of these leases that I've seen, they'll give them like a great deal, like for year 1 through 3, and then like 3 to 5 or something like that. And then after like year 5 or whatever, they just like, it might be $20 a square foot. And by the time it goes up, now you're paying $30 a square foot or something insane, $40 a square foot.
Absolutely. And it happens. So here's the things to look. First, you want to make sure that the current lease is transferable, because that's upon which the financials have been based. Then the language you want to look for in a lease is in the assignment or transfer clause. No matter what it says, that the tenant can't transfer this without the landlord's written authority, which is all pretty standard. But there's language in there, the following words, that the lease transfer shall not be unreasonably withheld. Again, should not be unreasonably withheld. And landlords want to know 2 things. They want to know the place is occupied and you're going to pay your rent. However, the bigger point here is that you want to go to the landlord and say, okay, well, if you can't live with this lease going forward, if there is that case of a big increase coming into play, if you can't live with that increase, you want to have a new lease in place. And so those are plenty of things for your listeners to chew on as far as the whole process. I mean, it breaks down in due diligence to 11 specific categories. It could be up to 200 items. It usually is not that many, of course, for every particular business, but you've got to be methodical, because you want to investigate the business. You don't want to uncover problems after you buy it. And everything you can mitigate for everything if you do this in a logical, methodical way.
And I think what you just said about the existing structures, because the business has structures and systems that already exist, you will deal with some inflexibility. And sometimes it's just too expensive or troublesome to change up the way the business is being run. And so, especially when you've got all these employees that are used to doing it one way, and then now if you change it up. So I think that's one of the downsides that you have to really look at, is that if you think about, okay, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to implement new systems, I'm going to overhaul the branding, I'm going to, retrain the staff members, sometimes that's harder than it looks.
It's a terrible strategy. And sorry to interject, because it's so important, because I know you probably see it where people are thinking that way. It's a horrible, horrible plan. And here's why.
Yes.
The whole idea of buying an existing business, from my perspective, is you buy a good business. You don't buy a garbage business. You don't buy a great business. You buy a good business, meaning that it has room for growth. It has the process, procedures, systems, and in place, and things that you could build upon. It's bypassed already the startup challenging stage. 96% of businesses go bankrupt in the first 5 years after startup. So you've gone past all that, all the startup heartburn and headaches. You've overcome that. That's why you're buying an existing business. But it's very easy from the outside to think, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to add that. I'm going to change this salesperson. I'm going to remove this branding. I'm going to add that branding. We're going to start selling B2B channels in addition to B2C. We're going to, you know what? At the beginning,
start over then. If you want to make that
nothing.
Changes.
Yeah, I mean, you know nothing. So you know nothing about this business. You've done the investigation and you've determined that it's a good business. That's the reason behind buying the good business. So one of the things that I tell people, the final chapter in my course is post-purchase priorities. And part of that is you do nothing. You shut up, you watch, and you learn for the first 90 days. Understand how the business works. It's very easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and think all these wonderful things that you're going to do. But realistically, when you think about it, don't you think the seller has probably tried most of them?
Yeah.
And if they haven't, don't you think you need to have a little bit of insight and experience with the business to determine whether or not that's a viable option? Because at the beginning, you know nothing. So shut up, sit down, close your mouth, 2 ears, observe, ramp up your learning curve as fast as possible. Then you could potentially make changes. And you don't want to make massive changes because the employees will probably flip out or the customers will flip out. So learn. You got to learn before you can earn. It's like you got to do this at a good pace. Get comfortable, marketing, get the guts of the business into your belly and you understand it. And then you can make some changes. And because if you're looking at a business and if you believe that it needs all these new things, probably not a good business to buy. Actually, I'll go further. It's not a good business to buy. Buy something where you can get the keys on Monday and take a paycheck on Friday.
I love it. Well, this has been so much fun. I'm so glad we got together. I'd love to have you back on the show for another episode, because this has been a wealth of knowledge. Tell listeners where they can find you and where they can follow you.
Very easy. You can find me on richardparker.com. All of our free articles and reports, anything related to selling, buying a business are there. And there's lots to choose from. Our course is available there as well. And we're on all the social media of Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn and YouTube. And we try to provide some good, valuable information, videos and otherwise on all of the platforms. And certainly if someone wants to educate themselves, richardparker.com is a great place to go. And there's easy to get in touch with me through that website as well.
I love it. Well, this was great. Thank you guys so much for being with us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real Life Leadership. If you'd like to get the show notes or access more resources, log on to reallifeleaders.com/podcast to get the show notes from this episode and any other resources we might have mentioned. And also, we'd love to hear from you. Be sure to review or rate this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. And if you have any leadership questions you want answered, email podcast@reallifeleaders.com.